Hi, everybody. First, I want to say thank you to the organizers for putting together a truly wonderful remote conference. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about some of the tools and techniques maintainers can implement to help deal with the age-old question. Is this issue actually a bug report or is it a help request? Before we get into that, let me introduce myself. I'm Eileen Uchitelle. I'm a principal software engineer at GitHub, where I've worked for a little over 4 years. If you want to connect after the talk, I'm going to be on GatherTown, but you can also find me anywhere online, like GitHub, Twitter, etc., at the handle Eileen Codes. I'm also one of the maintainers of the popular web framework Ruby on Rails. For anyone who's unfamiliar with Rails, it's a framework written in Ruby. It's been around since 2004-ish. And the goal of the framework is to make writing web applications fun. We try to do all of the tedious work for you by providing sensible defaults for the database, web server, and front end. I've been contributing to Rails since 2014, and I've been a member of the core team since 2017. While Rails started out small, its popularity grew quickly, and more companies decided to use it to build their applications over the years. Today, Ruby on Rails is used by hundreds of thousands of companies, including Kickstarter, Shopify, Airbnb, Dribbble, Zendesk, of course, GitHub, and many others. When an open source project first starts, as many of you have experienced, the number of users is somewhat equal to the number of maintainers and contributors because the users are the maintainers. We generally build tools that we need in our day-to-day, so naturally, we're the first users and the first maintainers. However, as your project becomes more and more popular, the user to maintainer ratio begins to diverge. We can see this clearly with Rails' success. As it gained popularity and was adopted by companies around the world, the user base increased, and now they drastically outnumber the contributors and maintainers on the project. To give you a sense of the user to maintainer ratio on Rails, let's look at some stats. According to Ruby Gems, Rails has been downloaded 284 million times and is used by 1.8 million websites, according to Build with Trends. In contrast, only a little over 3,000 people have ever contributed to Rails, and we have 11 core maintainers. While the user to maintainer funnel is a natural progression in open source, it has an effect on the maintenance of a project. It becomes harder and harder to keep up with bugs, pull requests, and how do I do this type of questions. There are many results of this progression and things that you'll have to deal with as a maintainer as this funnel becomes more pronounced. But today I specifically want to talk about how this phenomenon makes it more likely that you're going to get support requests rather than bug reports. And it can become increasingly difficult to tell the difference if you don't have any tools or techniques to help with that. Specifically, I'm talking about when you get an issue on your project and it sounds like a bug, but after digging in, it becomes clear that there isn't a bug in the framework feature, and it's just being used incorrectly or the documentation was misinterpreted. When there's a bug in the application instead of the framework, but you don't have tools or processes for identifying the difference, you end up spending hours debugging someone else's application. While we always want to be helpful, with the size of the Rails project and the number of companies using it, those types of requests could end up taking all day. We need to avoid getting nerd sniped into debugging someone's application when there are hundreds of legitimate bugs that need our attention. So today we're going to look at some of the tools and processes that we've implemented in the Rails project in order to shorten this process and make sure that we're debugging framework bugs and not application issues. Of course, none of these are perfect, and I still spend a fair share of my time digging into issues that turn out to be a misconfiguration and the framework is just working correctly. However, the goal of these tools and processes is to ultimately shorten the time to discovery so we can focus on making the framework more stable, secure, and performant. As your project grows and you start to have more users than maintainers, the first thing that you're going to need to do is to develop and implement a structure to grow your contributor base. You can't have a pipeline of maintainers if you don't first convert your users into contributors. And the best way to do that is to acknowledge them with access to your project and more responsibility. So in order to support Rails, we have a bunch of teams with different responsibilities. The first and newest team is called the triage team. We actually added this team very recently, like in the last few weeks, as a way to improve our response time on issues and pull requests. The triage team is made possible by GitHub's addition of the triage role, which allows us to give someone permissions to add labels and close issues and PRs, but doesn't grant them full merge rights. Members are added to this team once we see them contribute a few PRs or comment on a couple open issues. This is often the first team that users interact with, so the main requirement is empathy and good judgment. It's a quick to trust team, which will allow us to grow it at a faster rate than our other teams, because those teams require more responsibility and trust. At the moment, the triage team is 7 people, but we're aiming to make it much larger than that. The next team we have is called the issues team. Before we added the triage team, this was the team that was doing the majority of triaging, but we weren't able to add new members as quickly because this role also has merge rights. The team can do everything the triage team can do, but they're also allowed to merge non-code changes like documentation, guides, or change logs. But since GitHub has no way to distinguish between types of code changes, not merging code changes is based on trust, which makes it harder to add people as the day they start committing or contributing. There are currently 12 people on the issues team. And once you've shown considerable good judgment, empathy towards contributors, and technical ability, you may be added to the committers team. This team is permitted to do everything the issues and triage can do, but is also allowed to merge code changes. This team also requires a certain amount of judgment. We don't want every single change merged into Rails because that creates a support burden. The committers team must be able to distinguish between bug reports and support requests, but also be able to weigh the cost versus reward of merging changes. On this team, there are currently 10 people. Larger features or major API changes should be deferred to the maintainer team, which Rails calls core. The Rails core team is currently made up of 11 people from various companies that run on Rails. The core team is the only team that is allowed to release Rails and has final say based on consensus for major API changes and new framework features. All members of the core team were on the issues and committers team prior to being added to the core team. Lastly, of course, we have a security team, but that team is focused specifically on vulnerabilities and is a mix of the other 4 teams and other security-minded contributors. The Rails project isn't run by a foundation or a company, and membership of the teams is entirely volunteer-based. While some of us, like myself, are paid by our companies for our work on the framework, that isn't a condition of our involvement in Rails core or other teams. By having these teams in this structure, we're able to more quickly respond to users. Since the core team is only 11 people, we need the other teams to help sort out new issues and PRs and prioritize fixes and other things. The benefit of the triage and issues teams is we can make those teams really big, which will offset the number of requests that need committer and core team input. This also means that one person isn't going to get stuck debugging all of the users' issues just because they have more time. The triage and issues team can quickly determine if it's a bug, and if they aren't sure, they know exactly who to escalate to on the committer and core teams. Having teams won't directly improve the bug to support request ratio, but it does help share the burden and helps build up your contributor base. In addition, having a triage team empowers new contributors who want to get more involved to respond to new issues or request changes on a pull request. We found that before implementing this team, newcomers were less likely to jump in to help, even though they wanted to. The triage team is still small because it's currently being developed, but we're actively adding new contributors weekly to make this team really large and offset that support burden. In addition to a solid team structure, another way that we can reduce the support burden is by providing clear rules to users and new contributors so they know when and how to open an effective issue. The first way we do this is with issue templates. Issue templates are a GitHub feature that lets you set up specific templates for bugs, features, and other types of requests. In each template, you can add fields that you want users reporting issues to fill in. Issue templates are simple markdown and have a custom default message that's displayed when opening a new issue. Here's an example of what the issue template on Rails looks like. The template allows us to specify what information we need to fix an issue, steps to reproduce, expected behavior, actual behavior, and the Rails and Ruby version. This helps us quickly determine if the user's described behavior is a bug or not. If the actual behavior is what the user should expect, then we know we don't have a bug. We have a support request. If the version of Rails or Ruby is end of life, then we know we need someone to confirm whether the behavior still exists. We don't fix unsupported versions of Rails. So if it's fixed in the most recent version, then the user will need to upgrade to get a supported version to get that fix. These questions help reduce the bug report versus support request burden by asking the clarifying questions up front. We recently added directions of where to include the reproduction script, which anecdotally appears to have improved how many reports are opened with reproductions included automatically. Now let's take a look at some of our reproduction requirements. If an issue doesn't include some kind of reproduction, we mark it with a needs more information label and request the user provide some way of reproducing the bug. This requirement is super important because it answers a lot of questions. If the user can reproduce it easily, then we know it isn't a bug caused by an outside dependency, an operating system, or an application customization. This helps us answer the basic question everyone asks when they hit a bug: how do I reproduce this behavior? Without this, we can't even begin to ask deeper questions like, is this intended behavior, or how do we fix this bug? Users who have issues in their applications can provide a new application by running rels new command and then making necessary changes to that application to reproduce the issue. In addition, we also provide a set of scripts for each of the libraries within Rails for a more isolated reproduction. Here's an example of our template for active record. You can see it's pretty simple. We include a few required libraries, establish a connection to the database, add a table, and make some assertions. Users reporting bugs can add on to this script by creating tables and associations that match the behavior that they're seeing. Scripts like this save us a ton of time because they run faster than an application, but they also make it really easy to understand what's going on in isolation. The assertions can help tell the story of what the user expects in code rather than just in words. Additionally, it helps the user understand the problem better because they're forced to think about it outside the context of their own application. Often we use these scripts as a starting point for debugging, and if it does turn out there's a bug, having one of these repro scripts means writing regression tests is also a lot easier too. The reproduction script or application that they provide essentially cuts down on the time that it takes to determine whether the behavior is a bug or not. And once we have a reproduction, we get to use one of my favorite tools, Git bisect. Git bisect is great for determining if something is a bug or a support request because you can figure out exactly where the behavior change was introduced. Rails gets thousands of changes in each version, so finding out exactly what behavior changed and why can sometimes be next to impossible just by looking at commits or pull requests. By providing a reproduction script, we can easily bisect Rails by running the script to find where the change was introduced. Once we find the first bad commit, we can track down the pull request, which will help clarify whether the behavior is intentional. I wish I had time in this talk to show you all how awesome Git bisect is and how it works, but I don't. So if you're interested, there's a lot of great blog posts out there describing how to use this wonderful Git feature. Now that we've looked at some ways to figure out if a report is a bug, now we're going to look at ways to reduce support type issues from getting open in the first place, because isn't that all what we really want? It's very important that if you're getting a lot of the same questions or bug reports that are intended behavior, to look over your documentation. When I repeatedly see the same kinds of questions, I read through our docs around that feature and try to figure out what's missing. Are the docs incorrect? Do they maybe not exist at all? If the docs seem right, then I would say, well, is there a blog post out there giving incorrect information that everybody's following? Don't be afraid to ask the original reporter why they're using the feature a specific way to try to improve documentation so that your users can have a better experience and you reduce the support burden on your end. By updating the documentation, we can make it clearer what intended behavior is and hopefully avoid getting more bug reports that are related to incorrect blog posts or documentation. Sometimes seeing the question over and over again is actually an indication that you need to deprecate a feature. There was a feature that I wrote for Rails 6 multiple database support a few years ago. Over time, I was getting the same bug reports that were misusing the feature. The functionality was meant to be used in scripts like data migrations, but users were trying to use it for sharding, but it definitely was not built for that. I updated the documentation to make it clear what the purpose of the feature was, but I continued getting pignut bug reports that were using the feature incorrectly. Eventually, I decided that the feature needed to be deprecated. The support burden was drastically outweighing the benefit of the feature. Worse than teams using it wrong, it had potentially dangerous side effects when used in requests. I think we often worry that deprecating a feature will harm the community or our project's popularity, but sometimes it's important to keeping your project healthy and stable. Features that are misused or can't be supported should be deprecated and removed. In addition to deprecating the feature, I also added first-class support for sharding behavior that users were looking for. The number of support requests related to this functionality dropped drastically after I did that. And lastly, before I finish this talk today, I want to remind all of you to have empathy for your users. While being a maintainer is stressful and often thankless, there is a power dynamic in which we have a lot more power than our users. We get to say yes, we get to say no to changes and bugs. Some users aren't allowed to spend time on open source beyond the initial issue they opened. Others aren't allowed to contribute per their employment contract. Some users may be so new to your project, they don't even know where to begin debugging, and they're just frustrated that they don't know how to fix something. If you're interested in diving deeper into the vulnerability that it takes for your users to contribute, I gave a talk at Universe a few years ago called The Unbearable Vulnerability of Open Source, which dives into this topic of having empathy for your users. I'd love to get deeper into that topic today, but I only have 15 minutes, so go watch that talk if you're interested. I hope you all enjoyed learning about how we handle bug reports and support requests on Rails. Thank you all for watching. Our processes and tools are far from perfect, and we're working on making them better. If you have any ideas or suggestions for us, things that have worked on your project, please reach out. Again, you can find me anywhere online at Eileen Codes, and I'll be on GatherTown after this as well. Thank you.